Hi, good afternoon. Thanks, Miles, and thanks, Rabobank, for having us. So I'm going to introduce panel members really with questions as we get going here, but I thought we would just take a couple of minutes to set a little bit of a framework for this discussion, and I hope what will be a little bit of a framework for the presentations that will follow our panel. And so the topic I kind of gravitated to for this, which is one we've talked a lot about at Stone Barns, which is where I spent a good part of my day, is this attempt to define sustainability a bit. You're going to hear it probably in a bunch of presentations, and if you don't hear it in terms of the word itself, you'll hear directions from presenters who are aspirationally trying to improve the food system by moving us towards a quote-unquote more sustainable future. But what does that actually mean? And in my experience, where I sit, a lot of people are defining the word a lot of different ways. Some of them in ways that are just convenient to their businesses, and other ways that are earnest but not exactly accurate. And in most cases, sustainability as it's described today, again, my opinion, it's really not sustainable. It's just a little bit better than what we've been doing before. So what, if you were going to really look to the long term, what are some definitions of sustainable that actually stick? And this is the one that I was just going to introduce the panel with and ask you to keep it as a framework for the discussion. And this work came from a biologist, a couple of biologists, and an economist, and I won't bore you with the whole story, but they're really good resources, particularly the biologist, to talk to when thinking about sustainability in ecosystems. And ecosystems in nature are great things to look at on this topic because if they're there to be studied in the first place, meaning an ecosystem has survived, it's not a decade-old thing or a century-old thing or even a millennial-old thing, it's a very old thing that's been around for a long time. So if it's survived, looking at the characteristics that enabled it to survive are a great place to start examining a definition of sustainability. So quickly, what these guys developed, which I thought was unique and sort of simple enough for me to understand and follow and hopefully share with you, is that in nature, true sustainability is really about a trade-off between efficiency and resiliency. And there's sort of a small balance, that sort of optimum zone, and if you look at the bottom axis as more of a seesaw, where you put the weight is where you exist. And you want to try and maintain that balance. Efficiency is throughput in a business environment. For the food startups that I'll talk to you today, it's competitiveness and the ability to survive in today's economic environment, really run a business. And resiliency is natural changes in our environment, in our system, in agriculture, in the case of food, that will change over time, and how do those businesses prepare themselves to react. Can you switch to the next slide, please? One more, who's running slides? Oh, sorry, I'm supposed to do that myself. Okay, so there's the optimum. Sorry, one more. You want me to do that? I can do it myself. Faster. Okay, so if you rely too much on resiliency, this is true in nature and in business. You protect yourself too much. You are preaching the addicts of a natural environment in the food world. You are going to subject yourself to very efficient competition, which will undoubtedly be in the wings and wipes you out. If, on the other hand, you are too far on the efficiency side, you become dependent on systems and situations remaining constant. So I would argue that our food system and a lot of our business is really heavily weighted in efficiency today. We've carved all the resiliency out of the system in the name of kind of short-term profits and or short-term success. In agriculture, biggest examples would be free ecological resources, which may not be here, and the system is not really built to accommodate the notion that water would have to be paid for in a lot of places that grow our food, just as an example. So how do you weigh these two things, and how do you keep the emphasis in a way that keeps you at that balance in the middle? So the discussion I want to have with these gentlemen today, and I'm going to bring them out now if you guys come out, is what they're doing in each of their fields to walk that balance. They all have aspirational ideas that speak to very heavy weight on that resiliency, but they're balancing those on a day-to-day basis with the realities of needing to be pretty efficient in order to survive. Okay, so with that, I'm going to sit down for a second. I'm going to start with Scott. So Scott is from Sir Kensington's, which is a condiment company that is how many years old now?
5 years.
5 years. Okay, so these guys are 5 years out. They are trying to, as by their own definition, restore some integrity and charm to overlooked foods, and condiments is sort of the first example of that. I'm a consumer of the product, a big believer in it. And it's an interesting category in that not a lot of people really try to make a change in the way that Scott and his company are going to. So my first question for Scott, and I wanted to kind of focus on R&D because for your company to be successful, you've got to grow product line. So for those of you who don't know Sir Kensington's at the moment, ketchup, mustard, mayo, variety of sizes. The ketchup for me was probably the one that took the most adjusting to. It's missing all frankly, the sugar in Heinz. And I now love it in the way that I love less sweet sodas as compared to sodas I drank when I was a kid. The mustard and the mayo both have the integrity of the ingredient, but flavor and approachability. And where I'm going with this is where, as you're developing those products and products that you're going to do coming down the road here, how do you balance your aspirational desire for a healthier food, a more ecologically friendly production process, and a unique product that's going to shake up this category without letting your R&D department kind of run amok and bring you things that are never going to work in the market at a scale that you need to make your business successful?
Thank you, David. And that's an excellent question. And for us, it really is all about going back to basics and thinking about product development and R&D from the perspective of meeting unfilled consumer needs and finding a way to fill those needs. When we started, we didn't say that we knew exactly what the perfect ketchup, mayonnaise, and mustard were going to taste like and how to make them. Instead, we began by prototyping. We knew that there was something broken in ketchup, that there was a lot of high fructose corn syrup, and here was American food and mainstream food culture changing and moving forward, but ketchup and condiments were left behind. And so we began by prototyping and recipe testing, and instead of in a traditional focus group standpoint, we would throw these parties and get our friends to come over. And it was in those moments that we learned actually what had the most traction and what people were most excited about. And so that really helped us, on that efficiency side, make sure that we produce something that people actually want and delivers on that sensory experience. Now, making sure that sustainability and the resilience is really built into what we do, sometimes what people will tell you in the market will lead you astray. And people won't always necessarily tell you what they'll pay for a product or what they won't pay for a product. But our third value as a company is to build condiments with character. And what character really means is that integrity that you talked about, making sure that we have the integrity of our ingredients and the integrity of our suppliers. And so in many ways, that R&D and that production process isn't just the creation of something that tastes great, but to your point about making sure it doesn't run amok, a lot of what we do is really look at and reinvent supply chains to make sure that they can actually go to the shelf at a price point, that they can work with our existing and new retail partners and actually thrive ultimately in the kitchens of our customers.
Okay, so just a quick follow-up. Reinventing supply chains in a low-margin condiment business sounds like a really expensive exercise. So as you raise capital, how do you justify putting that kind of investment to work, given growth, long-term goals, needs for sales and marketing, kind of the rest that follows?
Another great question, and this is actually something that Dan and I were talking a bit about backstage, and I look forward to him telling you about what he does, but he was explaining that, in so many different industrial food contexts, there's really not a lot of immediate problem solving, and what was the phrase that you used? Was it thoughtfulness or cleverness in this? And so in a lot of ways, the things that we're doing are not capital intensive. They're just reframing the problem, looking at it from a different perspective, and asking what question hasn't been asked here. So it's not that these things are phenomenally expensive. You know, in some cases, we're looking at reappropriating waste products. In other cases, we're asking questions that have never been asked to our tomato suppliers. And so in those ways, investors are happy to hear the solutions.
Okay, thanks. I'm gonna turn to Gabriel for a second. Gabriel is from Syngenta. For those of you who don't know, Syngenta is the biggest seed company, right? Pretty much in there.
One of the global leaders,
Right?
yep.
One of the global leaders in seed, and also is in the crop protection industry. It's not a world that I spend a lot of time in, but fascinated by the scope and reach of these big companies to affect agriculture today, even if it's improving it a little bit. The impacts are, for one, global as opposed to a United States phenomenon, but also just even in this country, the acreage involved is staggering. So my question, and Gabriel, you know, is not in the specific businesses that I just mentioned within Syngenta. Instead, he's more in the funding category and looking to fund businesses that are going to impact the future of Syngenta's direction and become strategic investments for that company as it tries to navigate a changing system. So my question for Gabriel is, you know, how do you weigh, and I should just add for those of you who didn't read the bio, Gabriel's perspective is really unique because he cut his teeth at organizations like Rodale and Polyface Farm, which is Joel Salatin's place in the Shenandoah Valley, which for those of you in the sustainable food movement, you know, Joel's one of the preachers, literally a preacher, but also you know, kind of the Bible-toting reference for a model farm. So Gabriel doesn't come at this from just the big perspective. He has a very deep and personal understanding of a ground-up movement in the farming world and the principles that go along with that. So in your seat now, deploying, you know, what's probably quite significant capital for everyone in this room towards these issues from Syngenta's perch, how do you justify the idea that you are working within a food system and from a place where big is not necessarily helping us move this forward at a rate that we'd like to see? And how does big ag move with this movement and make incremental steps towards changing the food system that we can all agree on? How do you make those decisions against what is obviously going to be big pressure from a big organization like Syngenta?
Sure, so I definitely think that big agriculture has a place in the sustainability conversation, and I kind of tie, you know, what I do now as an investor for Syngenta Ventures. It's a continuation of some of the same things I was looking for when I joined, you know, coming out of school, Rodale, and then Polyface Farms. I was, at the time, trying to find, you know, what are the most sustainable and profitable farms that I could work for, and what can I learn from those? And now as an investor, I'm still looking for what are the most sustainable and profitable things that I can do, but instead of deploying in a small farm capacity, you know, with the big company environment, I'm looking for things that can scale across the world. You know, if it's something that works in New Zealand, well, why can't it work in Wales, and why can't it work in, you know, Northwest US and things, and how can we bring that across? And so the big company perspective really gives you two things. On one hand, it's that scale and global access and marketing capability. And the other, for agriculture specifically, is a de-risking that a lot of times needs to happen with agriculture innovations. They don't arrive for the farmer fully formed. They take some time and some maturity. And farmers that are kind of on that precarious point, trying to find the optimum between, you know, resilience and efficiency, and they don't have sometimes the capacity to take on a lot of risk to do this development. And so the big company can do the R&D to make sure that when it gets out into the farmer's hands, it's ready. It's a product that performs like it should. So in that capacity, I'm pretty excited by the work I get to do.
And do you find that the interest in that is accelerating in a way that enables agriculture to kind of keep doing what it's been doing, or that it's enabling it to change in a direction that, you know, people will ultimately look back on this period of time and say, you know, hey, big business was was towing its weight. And I don't mean it sounds like, especially with your background, you're doing that part. I just say in general, as you look at funds flowing into this space, is it about doubling down and protecting the status quo more, or is it about we see the future and like we got to get on board?
No, I think everyone who's active in the ag industry is sort of staring at the problem and thinking we're going to have more mouths to feed, and how are we going to do it with the finite resources on the earth? And there's a lot of different approaches that you could take, but the problem's not going away. And from a big company perspective, if that's the ethos that the consumers and government and we all recognize is the way we need to go, then big companies need to adapt to meet those requirements.
Yeah, great. Okay. We got a little limited time, so I want to come back to hopefully each of these if we have time, but I want to get Dan some time here. So Dan Gusti was the head chef under Rene Redzepi at Noma for 5 years. For those of you who don't know Noma, I don't know what rock you're hiding under, but I've yet to eat there, although I've been privileged enough to have a little bit of Rene's food when he's visited New York. Renowned globally as the best restaurant in the world by many measures for a long time. And Dan was, running the helm there for a number of years during the height, and the height that's continued since he left. In building that restaurant. He's come back to his home country, good for us, the United States, to start a company called Brigade, and Brigade is taking aim at school lunch and the school lunch system, and taking the lessons, which I'm going to allow him to talk about, of Noma, and trying to apply them to a very specific audience, namely kids. And if we're talking about this long-term view of food, to a certain extent, we're preaching to a converted group in this room, or at least at some level. And I think increasingly, even nationally, we're starting to kind of turn that corner. But kids remain this incredibly important audience that doesn't know what it doesn't know yet. And lunch is going to be a big place where they learn that. And how lunch changes, I think, over the next 10, 20 years, will drastically impact what those kids do when they get out of school, and what they demand from the food system. So I applaud Dan's work. We'll get back to why he's actually doing this. But I wanted to get specific on the business side, this idea of survival. It's notoriously tough to affect school lunch, because the value that we as a society have placed literally on the ingredients, but really the whole process is minute. The numbers are truly frightening, what schools deal with in terms of a budget to feed children. So how, Dan, coming from Noma, which is not a cheap undertaking, and focuses on all this quality ingredients, how do you approach this, knowing, eyes wide open as you go into it, that the financial realities are going to come up quickly and in a daunting way, I think?
Yeah. There's no question it's tremendously difficult. And I want to preface my response to saying that I apologize if I offend anyone here, because it's become a hot topic, this whole school lunch thing. And I feel like every time I share my opinions and my view on it, there's someone bound to be upset and disagree. So hopefully all of you agree with me. Otherwise, this will be very uncomfortable sitting here. So as David said, I've spent the majority of my career working in fine dining, and most recently with Noma, so it's a very different thing there. It's 45 chefs for 45 customers. All those chefs working 18 hours a day and running around and basically doing anything that you ask them to do at the drop of a dime. So that's pretty easy. That's not a very difficult situation to manage. You can just tell people what to do and they do it. In school kitchens, it's a very different atmosphere, as I'm sure you can all imagine. There's so many challenges, and mostly have become pretty public lately, especially the cost of school meals. The reimbursement rate for lunch is $3.07. So those of you who work in food, most of you do, $3.07 to cover a lot of things. Most people just assume $3.07 is to cover food and labor that would be directly associated with that meal. But in fact, it's to cover everything in that program. Most food service programs within schools are self-sustaining. So even food service programs that are run internally and not by larger companies such as Aramark are actually paying the school money for utilities to run that kitchen. It's actually pretty ridiculous. A lot of the food service programs have it very difficult. But moving forward, to tackle this problem, I think, again, what Scott was saying, there's definitely a lot of things that haven't been looked at. It's a lot of the same people who've been doing a lot of the same things, and that's no offense to them at all. Unfortunately, the school lunch space has not been the most attractive space for chefs to get into. You know, to say the least, it's actually probably the last place on earth that most ambitious chefs would want to get into. I'm tackling it because I feel like it's a worthwhile challenge, and a big part of Brigade's goal, hence the name, it's a group of chefs. It's to get chefs involved. It's to make it an attractive setting for chefs to want to go in there and look at these problems. And I feel very passionately that chefs are the most appropriate people to tackle these problems. When you take a school of people that's feeding 800 kids a day, and the person who's in charge of that school and to make sure everything's happening appropriately and to excite the kids about food is making $25,000 a year and working 6 hours a day, it's not going to happen. I mean, I think most people would be shocked that in most schools, custodians are making $45,000 to $50,000 a year, which I feel is appropriate. And as we all know, teachers maybe are one of the most underpaid group of people in the United States, but school food service workers get paid absolutely nothing. Again, $25,000. In fact, in some of the schools that I visited, some people were making less than that, $22,000, $23,000. So to expect that these people will be able to run a kitchen that's supposed to feed 800 kids in a day. I mean, most restaurants, if you were to feed 800 people a day in a restaurant, that would mean that you're a high-volume restaurant, which would generate a lot of revenue, which most likely would mean that your chef is getting paid a very good wage, not $25,000. So again, a big part of Brigade is to make it attractive, to pay people appropriately to get chefs into those kitchens, and not only to make the food better. I think the food is almost, in my opinion, over the past several weeks that I've been visiting schools, has become secondary to the mentality and the kind of frame of mind that people approach school food. I think it's a waste of time to change all the food before you change the way people think about school food. Many people in this...
I'll just cut you off to ask, what, in your mind, what's an outcome in terms of that change in perception? What are you trying to alter in that? You just mentioned that, you know, it might not be the ingredients, at least not out of the gate. What's the experience you think you want the customer, the kid, to have that's going to contribute to a future food system that we'd all want to get behind?
Right. So I think, again, going back to the word that Scott mentioned, thoughtfulness. So I just want to give you an example of a meal that I saw a couple weeks ago in a school that, to be completely honest with you, was running a school food service program that was not nearly close to the worst that I've seen in the past couple months. And I want to make a note quickly that there are many school food programs that are doing very well. They're just not replicating at scale across the country. But one school meal that I saw, this is a lunch you need to keep in mind, and this is a lunch that's supposed to feed, for example, either a first grader who weighs 40 pounds or an 18-year-old aspiring Division I athlete who weighs 250 pounds. So for lunch, a yogurt parfait, a mozzarella steak in a bag, a muffin in a bag, an apple that hasn't been touched, and a milk in a carton. So that's a meal. So there's no one who's thought about that as being a good meal. There's no one. No one in that school district would tell anyone to say, you know, we really thought about this, and we really thought that this is a great grouping of food to put together for a meal. And it's funny, but it's the truth, and it's sad. It's like, who wants to eat? It's like a joke almost. And then moving forward on that, of the thoughtfulness, and this is the thing, I've received a tremendous amount of kind of criticism and skepticism since I've decided to do this, because many people just assume that because I came from NOMA that my approach to this is going to be very much high in the clouds, and that I'm going to go into these school kitchens, and we're going to cook all organic, and we're going to razzle-dazzle all this. No, but that's not the case. So going back to that muffin in a bag, because I think it's the best example. So you have 6 school food service workers that work 6 hours a day to prepare that meal. The only thing that was actually prepared, if you remember, was the yogurt parfait. Everything else was in a bag or purchased pre-made. That muffin was a corn muffin. That corn muffin was inside of a bag. It was condensating because it was still partially frozen in the middle. And that's what they're serving. So my first inclination is at least that can be taken out of the bag. And then it's a muffin in a basket, maybe with a towel, even if someone has time to put a cloth there. God knows it would take an extra 10 seconds to do it. Or ideally, put that muffin in the oven. Heat the muffin up so it's a hot piece of food. It's a prepared piece of food, and it actually smells like food. I don't know any of you the last time you were in a school food cafeteria, but it never smells like food. It doesn't smell like bad food. It doesn't smell like good food. It just doesn't smell like food. And to me, that's not a kitchen, and I think that's a shame that our students, every day when they go to lunch, they go into a sterile space that doesn't smell like food.
All right. I'd love to talk to these guys all afternoon, but we are here to hear the presenters that have worked hard to prepare for their 5 minutes. We've been greedy in taking up 30 minutes, and I'm going to kick it back to Miles, and hopefully we'll see all of you a little bit later this afternoon. Thanks for the attention.